Your Honor, one thing I was told repeatedly when I was growing up is that to be very careful who you point the finger at. When you point the finger at someone, three more are always pointing right back at you. And nowhere in my career have I seen a case where the finger of accusation being pointed at a client has three more pointed back at the prosecution more strongly and more firmly than this one right here. I'm going to submit to you, just very plainly, that this case is being thrown in your lap because the prosecution doesn't trust you. They don't trust you to convict Mr. Dinkins on this evidentiary record. They want you to decide this case on emotion. They want you to decide the case with cameras and media in the courtroom, all the officers sitting here. They want you to decide the case based upon that, rather than this fairy tale that they've spun, and this circumstantial, and I use that in quotes, evidence case that they want you to believe. Rhetorically, I want to look you in the eye. I want to ask you a couple of questions. Are you totally convinced that Henry Dinkins committed these crimes? Are you firmly and fully satisfied that the evidence that's been presented before you is enough to say that Henry Dinkins committed these crimes? Those are really the burning questions for you, because that's what reasonable doubt comes down to. You know, our Supreme Court has approved the jury instruction that says, based upon all the evidence, drawing all the inferences from the evidence, or in some cases lack of evidence produced, would a reasonable person hesitate to act? And I would submit to you that if someone come up to you and said, did Henry Dinkins commit murder in the first degree? Did Henry Dinkins commit kidnapping in the first degree? Would you immediately say yes, or would you have to stop and think? There's no way on this evidentiary record that you would not have to stop and think, because there simply is no evidence to support the state's theory that this man committed these crimes. You simply cannot say, based upon what has been presented here, that Henry Dinkins set out on a plan to sexually assault this 10-year-old girl and then decide to execute her, because that's what it was. It was an execution. Any reasonable person would hesitate to act on this record. A person may have an opinion. I think the state has an opinion. I think the state feels they got it right. I think the state thinks that Henry Dinkins did this, but that's not the standard. The standard is, did the state prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? This is not a whodunit. This is not a whodunit. This is who proved it. I find it ironic that we're talking about Henry Dinkins committing sexual abuse upon Breasia Terrell, but we're not here talking about him being charged with sexual abuse upon Breasia Terrell. I find that very ironic, and so should you. I find it ironic that there's not one piece of physical evidence that can say ever that Henry Dinkins touched this girl in any way, let alone even give her an untoward glance or make an off-color comment or tell her she looks nice, even give her a compliment about her appearance. None of that. What we have is, and what this court is being asked to believe is, by fact that he wasn't paying attention to his biological son, therefore he must be some insidious intent toward a non-biological child with whom he had a relationship. And because he spent more time in the bedroom watching her play a video game and playing a video game with her and with Andrea Culberson, that got the wheels turning, and that got the libido moving. And there's absolutely no evidence of that. Andrea Culberson didn't give you any indication that Henry Dinkins was acting untoward toward Breasia Terrell. In fact, the evidence you've heard is quite the contrary. The evidence you heard from DL, and we'll talk a lot about DL down the road, but from Andrea Culberson, was that everyone was happy that night. It was a good night. You heard it from Aisha Langford as well, that when Breasia come down to get her clothes, she was happy. She was learning how to be an AT&T operator. It was a good night. Henry cooked dinner that evening for the kids. And he cooked dinner for Aisha as well, even though she's a stepchild. Aisha liked going over there because she liked the snacks. Breasia, because he liked the snacks. Now, is Henry Dinkins set about grooming this little girl with vanilla Oreos? I don't think so. Okay, that's a theory that the state may have. That speaks volumes as to what this case is. It's a case built upon conjecture. It's a case built upon supposition. It's a case built upon assumption. And it's a case built upon hypothesis. I think you heard Detective Obert say, it's the theory. That's in the record. It's the theory. We don't convict people on theories. We convict people on evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's just not here. The threshold question, of course, and the state admits this when they went into a sexual assault discussion right off the bat, is why. What motive did Henry Dinkins have to hurt this little girl? None. Absolutely none. In her 10 years of life, he had only been good to that girl. Was he there every day of her life? No. Was he there to provide and be the perfect father figure? No. But we're not judging him as a father. We're not judging him as a stepfather. But he was there enough for her to have a relationship with him. He was there enough for her to feel comfortable going there. And most importantly, he was there enough that Grandma, Danita Gardner, felt comfortable sending her along. I would submit that Danita Gardner would not have sent her grandchild along if she felt any inkling that this child was in danger, that Henry Dinkins would somehow sexually harm that child. That's common sense in this case. And in fact, you heard testimony that Henry first said, no, I'm going to spend the weekend with DL. And then DL kept saying, come on, Breasia, come on, Breasia. And finally, and you can see DL doing that. He's kind of a hyper rambunctious kid. Breasia relented and Grandma relented as well. But the plan, if there ever was one, was at that point for Breasia to come along. This man had not seen DL in over a month since the cookout, and so it was never discussed for Breasia to come over. So to think that he had some sort of preconceived notion that he and Breasia were going to engage in some sort of illicit activity just isn't there either. Aisha Langford was informed that Breasia was over there, and she was fine too. Both Danita Gardner and Aisha Langford testified that relationships between Breasia and Henry were good. And neither one had a problem with Breasia spending the night, even though it was the first night at this new location. So the crime just has to make sense. And the state knows this. The state knows this. I mean, they absolutely know this. So they try to spin this yarn that he's standing in a bedroom in this very small apartment, and DL says he peeks a couple times and sees Dad spending more time with Breasia. We're going to rely on that as a motive to commit a sex act, that he sexually abused this child? I'd say not. And then there has to be some connection to that and why he would want her dead. And the state has tried to put together this elaborate time frame with evidence that they say could be Henry Dinkins to say that he actually sexually abused her. Now, Ms. Cunningham called Henry very savvy. I disagree with that. I disagree with that wholly. I mean, look at this man right here. He is not a savvy individual in that regard. If you think about and compress this down to almost the most ridiculous time frame that we have, everybody in that apartment was, as far as the children, and Miss Culberson at least, asleep by midnight. Mr. Dinkins was in the Davenport Police Department by noon the next day. That's a 12-hour window. A 12-hour window for him to accomplish a lot of things that just doesn't make sense. Those 12 hours include waking up Breasia, who's a tattletale, who joins him voluntarily. And evidently, the theory is that some sedan, they can't identify that car as Mr. Dinkins, first of all, it's just a sedan, goes down to his RV, and these people get out of the car down to the RV. They can't put him in the RV. It's in the area of the RV. Henry rapes her, and then evidently goes back again to probably cover up the crime. Comes back and we know he's at the home at 3:30 a.m. At 3:30 a.m., he's in the house, and Breasia is seen by Miss Culberson outside the Impala. I think it bears noting that no one ever put Breasia inside that Impala. No one. Didn't even try. There wasn't even an effort to put her in that Impala. It was the assumption that she was in the Impala. At 3:30, then, they assume that these two take off. He drives her up to the area of Kunow Implement, 20, 30 minutes, kills her, somehow takes the time to shoot her 3 times, and we'll talk about the shooting, somewhat cover it up, and get back to Jersey Meadows around 5:30-ish and pick up his son. And he and his son go back to Clinton. It's 7 o'clock. They're at the Walmart in Clinton. They take their time coming back. If you believe DL's version of the events, he's covering it up with bleach out there, and they're back in town by 8 o'clock. And 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock, there's phone calls being made. He's supposedly moving about Clinton, but in this time also he's discarding clothes. He's showering and scrubbing himself up, making sure all possible crime scenes are sprayed with bleach, and doing it 100% successfully. So not only has he got the mindset to be able to do all this, but he's doing it to an absolute T. There's absolutely nothing left behind. They want to talk a lot about bleach and how bleach destroys DNA, but they also have to get you to assume and understand that not only if their theory is right, that Mr. Dinkins not only did it, but he did it to the point that he destroyed any possibility of DNA at any crime location on any piece of evidence. Because what they forget to tell you, Your Honor, is that they brought in the FBI crime team, okay? They didn't bring in just local people with local resources. They brought in the FBI crime team, and they spent hours combing that RV, okay? And in that RV, they took everything that they thought there would be DNA on. They took anything they thought there would be blood on. They took anything they thought there'd be semen on. They vacuumed their little special vacuums that thought would get any trace evidence on. They took hair. For crying out loud, these people were dressed in Tyvek suits, rubber boots, hats. That's how seriously they took preservation of evidence. And what do we know they found in the RV? Nothing. They were asked to test for blood and semen because from jump, this case was thought to be Henry Dinkins raped this little girl. And that was their theory, and that's what they were going with. The very first moment that man went to the police station, that was their theory. Can't convince me otherwise, Your Honor, because they were testing for blood and semen on July 14th. Why was they only testing for that? Why wouldn't they want all DNA to see maybe who else had been in there? Blood and semen. Their choice at that point was to make a case against Henry Dinkins, not build a case based upon the evidence. You see, they had already concluded that Henry Dinkins had done this. And now we're going to build the evidence around that conclusion and pick only the evidence that surrounds that conclusion. But nothing in that RV. Now, had she been raped in that RV, they would have found something. I would submit that to you. A hair, some sort of DNA. But they didn't test for DNA. And that's not his fault. It's their burden. It's their burden. And they had that evidence back within a month or so. And they had no blood, they had no semen, and they had no trace evidence. And they had a good year and a half to say, you know what, let's send that back to the FBI, or ask the FBI to test it, or send it on to the DCI. They can do DNA testing on any cuttings or swabs or fabric or whatever. But what was the answer we got when I asked that of Detective Pfeiffer? My supervisor said no. My supervisor said no. Not his fault. Their fault. Their burden. They say that she was assaulted in that RV. They need to prove she was assaulted in that RV. Not just say, well, there was cleaner bleach sitting there, so he must have cleaned it up. Okay, we now know we have a test for bleach. TCI, we heard Agent Stepanski. Okay, let's have Agent Stepanski test it for bleach. There's no elements breaking down anything in the RV. We have it in a controlled environment, for Christ's sake. Let's test that area for bleach. But then, if it hadn't come back with the answer they wanted, they'd pivot off that and say, well, you know, there's bleach in laundry products, and we wouldn't have found it there anyway. But note, when they searched that vehicle on July 10, when they went into that vehicle, hours after this young girl had supposedly been sexually assaulted, hours after this man supposedly sprayed it all down with cleaner bleach and killed all the DNA and got rid of any evidence, no odor of bleach was detected. And when you're going to kill DNA, Your Honor, I would submit that when you're going to kill DNA, you don't give it just a couple squirts. You make sure it's dead. You make sure it's gone. And in that enclosed environment, that small enclosed environment, you're going to smell bleach. But then they introduce these albatross pieces of evidence meant to scare you, meant to prejudice you, like the machete, which has nothing to do with anything in this case. There's no evidence that machete was used in any crime. There was no sharp force trauma to Breasia, Terrell, and Dr. Graham, Dr. Cruz both said that there could have been, maybe should have been, if that large knife was used to harm Breasia Terrell. And look at that evidence. Look at it closely. That machete is brand new. Not a nick on the blade. The hone, the edge on that blade is just like you bought it at the store. There's not so much as anything that would say that was used to cut a bush. It is brand new. But we have white fibers on there, and we tested it against some other fibers, and they didn't match, but we'll forget about that. And, oh, we have a baseball bat. I'm going to ask you rhetorically again, what does a baseball bat have to do with anything? It's in the evidence, and we found it in the trunk, and baseball bats can be scary in crime cases, but there's no evidence to support what the baseball bat has to do with anything. Well, it's a prejudicial piece of evidence and makes Henry look scary. And then the hatchet. Well, the hatchet, you look at that as well, brand new. Brand new, never been used. Never been used. Has nothing to do with anything in this case. You think back to the testimony of Danita Gardner. She was asked by the state about how Henry was with the children, and how he disciplined, and if he ever disciplined Breasia. The answer was no. In fact, his discipline with DL was not very often, but when he did, he made him run. He wasn't the guy that got physical with the children. At the cookout, he brought stuff for the children, brought them candy, things like that. He was an affectionate guy. No markers that he was trying to groom Breasia for anything. They want you to believe that he was that night in the bedroom playing video games, and this idea popped in his head, well, I'm going to molest this girl who I think of as my daughter. And now the state wants you to say, well, because he didn't do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rationally during a time where I would submit to you things were irrational. Your child is missing. Your son's mother's other child is missing. You may not think exactly the way that you would think in rational circumstances. So they're going to put judgment on that. They're going to put judgment on that. They're going to judge him as a stepfather and say, well, that makes him a killer. That makes him a sexual abuser. Bottom line is, the state developed their theory way too early in this case. And that theory was Henry Dinkins killed this girl. Henry Dinkins molested this girl, so now let's go find the evidence to find it. And the problem is they couldn't find it. They had all the evidence to possibly put her in that Impala, but they didn't test for the DNA to put her in the Impala, because the FBI was told she was in the Impala. And when it came back that we didn't test for DNA in the Impala, then the brass at the Davenport PD said, don't test for it. Why on earth was that not done? I'm going to have Mr. Waters also show a couple of photos right here. I'll have him state for me which they are. Which one is this, Joel?
It's 12-17.
Picture 12-17. This is a photo that come from the rear passenger side of the Impala. What I want the court to see there is you'll see 1, 2, 3 water bottles. You'll see a can of Pringles. You'll see a cup, a black cup there. What do people do with water bottles and cups and Pringles? They eat the Pringles, they drink the water bottles, they sip out of the cup. What do people do when they drink out of water bottles, drink out of cups, and eat Pringles? They leave DNA behind. Those weren't seized or handled for DNA either, all of which could have put Breasia Terrell in that Impala. None of which would have proved she'd been sexually assaulted, but all could have put her in that Impala that night. But that was ignored. Again, shows the theory that they were looking through tunnel vision and had their decision made. He sexually assaulted her, and that's why she's dead. We just got to find her, and we'll build our case around that. I'll have Mr. Waters show the other one. This is, sorry? This is 12-24, and this is from the rear driver door. And what you see there again, another water bottle, another Diet Mountain Dew bottle. You even see what appears to be a kid's mask. Now, again, those were drank by someone. A mask was worn by someone. Those are some things we can get DNA off of, Your Honor. None of those prove sexual assault. You aren't going to find any blood or semen on those. I know that. You know that. But again, those are items where we commonly find DNA. They weren't tested because their mind had been made up that she was in that car. He had raped her. And they'd find blood. But again, they had the opportunity, they had the evidence for a year, year and a half, and they just chose not to because the bosses said, don't worry about it. When you think about, you can take those off. When you think about the state's argument, they talked about how Henry portrayed himself as a father figure at the beginning of the interview. And toward the end of the interview, the issues between he and Aisha kind of came out, that it was maybe a little antagonistic. I don't know how that can be considered proof that he killed or raped anybody. Any relationship between people, especially who aren't together anymore, is going to have that. You can be a father figure to someone and not get along with mom all the time. I mean, this court is very experienced in things like that. But she said that Henry tried to show the outward perception that Miss Langford and Miss Gardner had a sense of trust about him, and that he would never do anything to hurt the child. That's not a perception, that's a fact. Those kids wouldn't have been there had those two individuals thought that Henry would never do anything to hurt a child. But since the interview got tense later on, something changed. Somehow those perceptions must have changed, and that's just not true. That's just not true. The evening went well. July 9th was a good time for all those people, and there was no need for anyone to concern or worry. And even Aisha said it went well, and she was there later that night. The death of Breasia, we need to talk about that, because it was an execution. It was a terrible death. Okay, I don't think there's any doubt that she likely was shot right where she was found. And think about the person that pulled the trigger. I would submit to you that the person that pulled that trigger was very close to that 10-year-old girl. And he pulled that trigger 1, 2, 3 times on a 10-year-old child. That takes a special kind of person to do that. That's not him. So fold that kind of person into the theory that the government wants you to understand. That, okay, we're playing video games. They made DL mad, at least to the point where he noticed it. He has this idea that now I'm going to molest this girl, and I did it, according to the state, and then I take her back home, according to the state. She gets out of the car, and she's a tattletale and all, and she waits. She waits outside the car, if you believe the state, right? She waits for Henry to supposedly go in and get a gun, which we heard no evidence of anyone ever seeing him with a gun, ever seeing him with ammunition, and I don't think the evidence came in that he was hiding something. Andrea Culberson said she just couldn't see him with anything. There's a difference. And then she waited for him to come back. Now, I think the government argued that he knew that she was going to tattletale on the fact that he had just molested her. So he went in and got this six-shooter that no one knew anything about, never seen before, with no additional ammunition anywhere. And I submit to you, that's pretty telling, because where you see a gun, you see ammunition. The likelihood of someone having a six-shooter with no additional ammunition anywhere is zero. Where you have a gun, you have ammunition. You saw that in Andrea Culberson's gun. She had 50 rounds right with her gun. You don't just carry around a cylinder full of Winchester 38 plus Ps. There would be 10, 12 bullets. Even if they were loose, there's always extra. So how did he know that Breasia was going to tell on him? You have to assume she said so. You would think she would be distraught. You think she'd be upset. But instead, she stands outside the car, according to Andrea Culberson, and if you believe the state's theory, she waited. And then she got back in the car with Mr. Dinkins. And then he goes to Quick Shop, and he goes in and gives 7 glances out to his car at 3:30 in the morning. And I'm not sure that's such a big deal, but if that's your evidence you're going to rely on to convict this man, that's a stretch, Your Honor. That's a big stretch. And he takes his keys with him at 3:30 in the morning. I would submit he should. And he filled up his tank with gas. Well, he needed a full tank of gas to go to Clinton. People fill their tanks all the time when they need gas. The fact that he's filling it up to go to Clinton is another speculation. That's not circumstantial evidence. That's speculation. The 7 nods out to the car, that's not circumstantial evidence. That's speculation. They're guessing on what he's doing. That's all they want to call it circumstantial, but it's all theory, it's all guesswork, it's all speculation. And this tattletale, who you would assume has just been through a very traumatic, terrible experience according to the state, stays in the car. Doesn't tattletale to anybody else. There's people in that parking lot, people going in and out of Quick Shop. She has a good mama, she has a good grandma. I'm sure she was told about stuff like this. If she's in that car, no evidence she was bound, no evidence she was restrained. Look at the video of the car just sits dead still right there. Nothing going on. So evidently she rides along, they go up to Kunow Implement, and then he takes her down in the woods, this girl he's fond of at least, and he walks her into the woods, and then essentially, from a very close range, this man has it in him to stick 3 .38 slugs in her head and chest and leave her there, and then have the time or whatever to try to cover it up. This is all thought about by him. So he's already covered up the sexual assault. So now he's killed her, he's executed her, and now he's got to cover that up. I mean, this man is the best cover-up artist, should be on TV. But now he's done that. Now he's done that, if you follow the state's theory. And then he decides to walk over and dump the gun in the water. Get rid of the gun. Now, they talk about time frames. Time frames, they can be fickle. People drive different speeds, people stop along the way, whatever. The time frames prove very little without something to put with it. So they try to use Jared Brink, okay? And don't get tripped up by Jared Brink. Do not get tripped up by Jared Brink. I'll have Mr. Waters use the pointer and point to the first picture up in the upper right. This is the information of Jared Brink. In the first picture way up right, that was the pictures of the vehicles and the photos of Mr. Dinkins that were shown to Jared Brink. Now, I will direct you to his deposition testimony and his interview, Your Honor. Mr. Brink told officers that he could not pick Mr. Dinkins out of a 6-person lineup. He did say that one of those on the top, I believe it was the upper right-hand corner, or maybe the one in the middle, could have been the driver of the car if he gained 50 more pounds. Okay? He also, in his deposition testimony, under oath, used the term Malibu that he pulled out. Not an Impala, he says Malibu. Okay? Remember, he's a car guy. They kept saying he's a car guy. He says he pulled out a Malibu. He also says that there was a white ox cord, right? But he also said that car had a tan interior. That's a tan interior. I'm not sure it's a tan interior. The state, which buttresses my argument that they found only the evidence they want, do self-tower analysis on Mr. Brink's phone. Now, we know where Mr. Brink lives. We know where Mr. Brink goes to work. Of course, Mr. Brink's phone would hit off a tower on July 10th, because that's the route he takes to work every day. Had we done Mr. Brink's cell phone tower analysis for 9 months, you're going to see that for 9 months. But again, let's just do it for July 10th, because that puts him as the man who pulled out this man from the ditch, and it fits the timeline just perfectly for us. Okay? We start at that conclusion. Let's get cell phone records for one day, and bam, that fits our narrative. But if we were collecting evidence about the case and being fair, we would have thought, let's get some from the spring and the fall as well, because Jared Brink said very clearly that it was cold that day. He thought it was the fall, thought it was 40 or 50 degrees. So let's not be fair about it. Let's just get the evidence we need so we can pin it on this guy. And it speaks volumes to the investigation that was done here. The other thing about the gun I think you need to think long and hard about is there was discussion about the gun and how guns in crimes like these many times are stolen. They're illegal. Serial numbers get ground off. This gun was traced back to the point of origin and has never once been reported stolen. That gun was legally purchased and legally owned by somebody. Legally purchased and legally owned by somebody. And there's no connection to that gun to Henry Dinkins. So Henry Dinkins, if he did shoot that person, did not steal a gun from anybody, and he sure as heck didn't buy it from anybody. There'd be a record of it. All we know is that gun came from Iowa City. But that particular firearm was never, ever reported stolen. There'd be a record of that. People have guns stolen. People report them stolen. I want to point the court out next to this soil sample testing that the state really relies on. And I want the court to look very closely at the exhibit on that. There's a couple of things about that that I think are important and very explanatory. Again, that is another piece of evidence that fits the theory. So let's point to those 3 areas of samples that were taken that are for inclusion, okay? Don't get tripped up by that word inclusion. It doesn't mean it's that it came from that area. It just means that it cannot be eliminated, okay? It's those word tricks that the FBI plays. Remember the testimony of the individual who did the soil samples. First of all, the 10 samples came from a very small area, the size of an automobile, okay? 7 of those were absolutely not a match. Those are excluded. So the size of an automobile, 7 don't match, 3 are supported for inclusion. That really doesn't tell us anything at all. says it could be the same soil. 3 out of 10, I would submit, you could probably find anywhere in the area. But look closely at that. We spent time talking about footprints that have nothing to do with anything. We spent time talking about Credit Island, nothing to do with anything. We spent time with DL, and DL is a troubled young man. But as it pertains to the state, you cannot pick and choose those parts of his story that are consistent and say, well, he's consistent on 1 and 2, therefore we have to say our investigation followed that. He was also consistent on other things that are not helpful to them. But he was wholly inconsistent on major facts. He come into court, he's 11 years old, and the state tries to say he's traumatized and this and that, yet they offer no scientific, no expert evidence to say that his testimony could be colored by that. They could have had a psychologist here. They could have had someone to testify that he has these memories recurring through post-traumatic stress or whatever he would have had. They chose not to. Not his fault. But he came in here and testified under oath that he saw his father shoot Breasia. We know that's not true. He saw Andrea Culberson go along and see his father shoot Breasia. We know that's not true. But all of a sudden we hear the story about pouring bleach in the ditch for the very first time 3 years later, after the number of times he's been interrogated and interviewed. That's very suspect. He's very antagonistic toward his father. He's being talked to by therapists and his mother. He's going to say whatever he needs to say to try to convict this guy. But we know the story about being there for the shooting is not credible, because we heard Officer Piper say the circumstances in which he believes DL overheard it. It was when Officer Piper was telling Aisha the day they found out. So that testimony obviously was tainted. I also would submit, you heard the video from July 23rd yesterday, and DL was certain that when he talked about a bloody knife and said, I heard it down here. You guys down here told me about it. And the officer, Detective Hammis, was quick to just dismiss it. No, you didn't. And then she said, well, maybe he overheard people talking and stuff like that. I think that taints that testimony as well. And they drive him around for 3 hours. He takes him to Credit Island and said, that's my dad's footprint. And they assume it's his footprint, and they start taking footwear impressions. His testimony was just so all over the place that it was not credible. He talks about a bloody machete where there's no blood on it. He talks about cleaner bleach. The first time we heard the term cleaner bleach was in here, before he was using bleach. But now we hear the term cleaner bleach. The photographs you're going to see in the RV, what do they say? They say cleaner bleach. He was coached into saying that. And he's preparing for trial. He saw a picture that said cleaner bleach. That makes his story more credible. He's going to nail his dad. I feel sad for that kid. I feel very sad for that child. But his testimony has been tainted. He said also that Breasia was alive twice at 5:30 a.m. And that was on July 23rd. State says, he's consistent on that, and that drove their investigation. That fact they ignored. They ignored the fact that he said Breasia was alive at 5:30 a.m. There was light out. Detective Hammis looked at her watch and said 5:38. They don't get to pick and choose what parts of his story they think are true and what part of the stories they think are untrue. They drove him to Clinton. And they pull into Walmart and, oh, this is where we were. They drove him to Credit Island. This is where we were. I mean, so much of this is almost confirmation bias, Your Honor. You got an 8-year-old kid, barely competent to even testify at that point in time, being guided by police, and again, being led down the way based upon a hunch. I think Detective Hamas said yesterday, based upon a hunch, we took him to Credit Island down that way. And then, you know, he told them what they wanted to hear. But Credit Island, it turns out, has nothing to do with anything. There were no 6 guys fishing. There was no fishing pool. But did that steer the investigation? Nope, it didn't. They ignore that. They ignore all that. But they find a couple of places where they can say we can hang our hat on DL's testimony, and we're going to hang our hat on that. The other stuff we're going to ignore because it doesn't fit the theory. It doesn't fit where we started and where we want to end up. He said on 61 and 30, we need to keep going straight, and they ignored that. Why did they ignore that? It didn't fit the narrative at that time. When they come back, he's pointing at wooded areas saying, there, 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 there. They ignore that. That is looking at a case through tunnel vision. We're going to have DL hopefully tell us what we want to hear. We have evidence. Well, we want him to tell us stuff that matches up to that evidence. That's exactly what they were doing. Mr. Dinkins is so savvy that he was able to cover up all his crimes. So savvy, so good. He is a psychopath with tendencies like no other to get away with this crime. You have to believe that. And that is unbelievable. Okay, so Henry has to know, Your Honor, that when you commit a crime like sex assault, assuming that he committed sex assault, which we have no evidence of, that you leave behind DNA and trace evidence. First of all, bleach does not destroy trace evidence. It destroys DNA, but it does not destroy hair, fibers, anything of that nature. Doesn't destroy any of that, which they found none of in that RV. They found no hair or fiber that connects Breasia Terrell to that RV. Zero. So bleach argument on that, out the window. If he's sexually assaulting her, there would be a hair that come off her. There would be fibers from her clothes. And this 4X white T-shirt comment that is somehow insidious on his part, parents all over this country let their kids wear parents' T-shirts to bed. Doesn't mean that they're trying to cover up a crime. That's somehow premeditation. That's just ridiculous. He let her wear the shorts and the bra, though. If he was trying to cover up a crime, why would he let her wear the shorts and the bra that Aisha brought, but covered up with a 4X T-shirt? That defies any logic anywhere. But in any event, he's so good at covering up his crimes that he takes this bleach and he sprays it everywhere. Hits every item of DNA. Kills it all. Kills it all. And then not only does he kill it all, he's savvy enough that no one can smell bleach except the woman who opened the trunk and was pregnant and had the heightened senses. That's the only person that said they smelled bleach. But makes it so no one can smell it. Makes it that no one felt or had the odor overcome them. So, in a very short period of time. So he bleaches everything, somehow gets rid of the odor, gets rid of all the DNA, and gets away with it. He's that savvy. That's not savvy. That's next level generation crime stuff for which this court and this attorney has, I would say, never heard of. But when you don't find bleach, like on the remains, it wasn't the state's fault because it was exposed to the elements. It was exposed to the elements, and there was an element of chlorine in the clothing. Your Honor, you know, chlorine is found everywhere. You heard Mr. Stepanski. That's why he would not say that there was anything there consistent with bleach. He was very careful about that. Okay, he was pressed on that issue because the state wanted him to go that extra step and say, well, could it have been bleach? And he wouldn't say that. They want to argue that now, but Stepanski wouldn't say that. That's the evidence in the record. And chlorine in Iowa, salt in the soil, farm chemicals in the soil, just basic soil. I mean, there's going to be chlorine everywhere, but bleach, it has to be bleach? No. I think that's a fool's argument meant to try to prejudice you. And look at that picture of those black shorts, okay? That's sun damage. And what do you do if you pour bleach on? Just common sense. You get a gallon of bleach, you're pouring it over from 6 feet above, you're just dumping it, you're dumping it. You get rid of all this. It's going to bleach almost immediately, it's going to splatter. You could have splatter marks. You don't see any of that. And in fact, Stepanski looked at that set of shorts and says, you know what, it's not even worth testing for bleach. Because he didn't test it. Okay, but they had all this other stuff. That's what defies logic, is they had all this other stuff. They had the stuff from the RV. They had the stuff from the Impala. They had all these cuttings. They had all this fabric. They had the car itself. They could have cut the fabric out of the trunk. They could have cut the back seat, the front seat. Send it all off to Mr. Stepanski and say, find us bleach, please. But no, we aren't going to do that. We aren't going to do that. Instead, they kind of want to shift the burden over to Mr. Dinkins and say, well, he didn't explain to us what he did. He didn't tell us what he was doing. He didn't explain to us about the gold shoes versus the white shoes. He didn't explain to us about things like pointing and writing on a Google map. You know, he didn't explain to us. He doesn't have to prove anything. They do. You can't forget, they had no DNA, and it wasn't for lack of looking on this man. Okay? They stripped him down naked. They swabbed his penis. They swabbed his hands. They went under his fingernails. And they found no DNA of Breasia Terrell. Oh, well, he must have bathed or showered then. Not his responsibility, theirs. And they didn't find any evidence that he did that. Well, he was driving around, he couldn't be found, his phone was off. That's why there's no DNA. Not his burden, their burden. Don't let them trick you into that. They had DNA that could have been tested possibly out of the back of the Impala to put her in that car. They chose not to do that. Why not? They had no semen anywhere, no blood stains anywhere, no trace evidence anywhere. They just want you to believe that Henry Dinkins was acting irrationally, acting weird, and he bought some bleach. And since he wasn't the real father of Breasia Terrell, and real fathers have designs on their stepdaughters, if you will, or children that are on their own, they must have raped and molested her because she wound up dead. Because that's what happens. Stepfathers rape and murder their stepdaughters. The evidence is not here, Your Honor. Are you firmly convinced? Are you fully satisfied? When you sit and think about this and go through all this evidence, will you hesitate to act? Reasonable doubt is all over this case. Serious doubt is all over this case. And there's only one verdict here. You have to find Mr. Dinkins not guilty.